Building Business Continuity Plans to Maintain Operations, brought to you by Honeywell Intelligrated. I'm Tracy Niehaus, Director of Marketing for Honeywell Intelligrated, and I'm your moderator today. We have just a few announcements before we begin. Please note that this presentation's audio is provided by phone number or through your computer sound system, so be sure to turn up your computer's volume. You may ask an online question at any time throughout today's presentation in the Q&A feature along the bottom of the screen. Simply type your question into the text area and hit send. Questions will be addressed at the conclusion of the presentation, with the exception of technical questions that can be asked and will be answered real time by our Zoom producer. Please note we recommend that you be hardwired when attending this webinar. A Wi-Fi connection may result in lag time in slides updating and graphics loading. Today's webinar includes polling questions. Please feel free to answer these questions when they appear and be sure to click submit so we can include your response, as we will be sharing the results real time during this live event. If you'd like to revisit key sections of today's webinar, it will be available on demand at intelligrated.com/on the move approximately 48 hours after this live event. You'll also receive an email in a couple of days with a link to the recorded event. Now on to the presentation, Building Business Continuity Plans to Maintain Operations. Discussing today's topic will be Diane Blair, Director of Field Operations for Honeywell Intelligrated. Diane is responsible for overseeing Honeywell Intelligrated's domestic and international contract services, including more than 400 technicians. In addition, she is in charge of Honeywell Intelligrated's Lifecycle Services International Operations. With over 25 years of experience in the material handling and logistics industries, Diane is an expert in facilities management and systems maintenance. She is a member of the Project Management Institute, is PMP certified, and honorably served in the U.S. Army. And with that introduction, the webinar will now begin.
Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining. So today's webinar is Building Continuity Plans. Continuity itself, if you look at Webster, the definition of continuity is a state of stability in the absence of disruption. Well, continuity in business is the requirement to keep your essential functions up and running during crisis or uncertainty and to recover with as little downtime as possible. In today's environment of the uncertainty presented by COVID-19 pandemic, social and political unrest, stability and continuity is something that every business and literally every individual, it's a valued outcome currently. But this outcome looks different to everybody. It looks different to different organizations, different types of operations, and different parts of the organization. Is your focus in DC operations or facilities? Are you a store manager? Is your focus in designing new buildings? And what the outcome of some of these current social and environmental impacts have on what you do next and what your next customer may be looking for. So a business continuity it's very critical for the entire business, not just your one little part. And today we'll focus on continuity plans that relate to ongoing business operations and how to plan for all the uncertainty that is in the world today. What is a business continuity plan? A business continuity plan, it's important for all types of organizations, regardless of size. It is important to realize that when you're in the middle of developing your business continuity plan, that you cannot, in times of disruption, you cannot potentially maintain all of your essential functions that you run on a day-to-day basis. You may not be able to run everything in that time of disruption. So a business continuity plan is, by its definition, a proactive plan to help you avoid risk, help you mitigate risk, and then help you recover from whatever happens. A business continuity plan has a set of strategies that you operate in to help you define your actual final strategy. They are preventive strategies, and preventive strategies are actions that take place and have to take place prior to the disruption. So a preventive strategy would be anything that you put in place that when a disruption happens, you can go right into that strategy and make sure that nothing worse happens down the line. A response strategy is a plan to address each identified risk. As we go through this webinar, we'll just determine that risks come from a lot of different places. But a response strategy addresses each risk, both internal and external. Recovery strategies are what you have to do after the disruption. You may not recover the same. Things may be different. So you have to make sure that you at least have a plan in place to address anything that may change during the disruption and into the future. Here's a polling question. So if you look at your business, what types or strategies of business continuity plans are defined? Please check all that apply. Do you have a prevention strategy in place? Do you have a response strategy in place? Or a recovery strategy in place? Do you know what all of those should entail? Please check all that apply. We haven't seen a lot of responses. So please check all that apply. We'll give you another minute or two to do that. If not, we'll go ahead and move on to the remainder of our webinar. So what should be included in your business continuity plan? A business continuity plan won't be the most fun day or month or even week or year maybe that you've had at work. It takes a lot of work. It takes a lot of collaboration between you and your colleagues at work. It takes organization, and it takes a little bit of definition and focus from the entire organization, both up and down from your current position. However, it's really an essential piece of making your business resilient from disruptions and resilient from any interruption that can happen or any natural disaster. When you create your business continuity plan, you'll need to analyze the who, the what, the when, the where, the how, and the why to understand how things fit together. As you create your plan and you analyze all your functions, you'll depend on the others and what each function, how each function interacts with each other. Your plan should include the purpose or the scope. And the purpose is really creating norms and standards that if something happens, you understand what everything is within scope and what you are focused on maintaining. It includes goals. Is your goal to protect the safety of employees? Is your goal to maintain customer service? Or is your goal just to protect physical assets? But it can go further than that too. You can't just look inside your own little building. What happens, is your goal to protect your brand or your reputation? And to get to a business continuity plan, we need to take a look at other things such as risk analysis, business impact analysis, recovery plans, response plans, and then of course restoration. Two of the largest points in this are risk analysis and business impact analysis, which we'll go through in more detail. But just at a top level, risk is when you identify the areas of exposure. identify your weaknesses, identify your strengths, and identify any dependencies within your organization, what one function can't do without the other. A business impact plan is actually taking those risks and understanding how they impact your business and your potential little corner of your business, and how you would utilize the dependencies, how you would utilize other areas of your business in order to determine your response and recovery. So the response plan is how do you maintain those essential functions? How do you know what to do and when to do it? Where are you getting help from? All of those things play into your response and recovery. And then of course your restoration plan. Your restoration plan is really what happens after you hit recovery. You need to stabilize your current normal. You need to move to long-term changes if those are required. And you need to identify the areas in which you need to focus on moving forward. So why? What's your why? How do you understand your purpose? Each business continuity plan must have a why. You have to know what the purpose is and what your objective is going forward. At its core, the business continuity plan is for you to create standards or processes that can be put into place when something adverse happens. And that aversion can be many things, as we'll look at later, but really it is a resiliency plan. How is it that you're going to maintain your on-time shipments? How are you going to limit your downtime? It is why you are putting this plan together. So you have to define the why. Additionally, with the why, you need to understand how far to go. So what is the scope? What is the scope of your operations? What is the scope of your plan? To understand your scope, you need to identify how many people and what things go within the scope of your operation. Pragmatic scoping can be the difference between you actually having a plan that works and you just continue in this unending loop by continually planning. So part of the things that we have to identify is to understand where all the components of your plan have to come from. So how would you classify your organization's appetite for risk? Risk is a component of your business continuity plan. Do you think that your organization has a high appetite for risk, a medium, or a low appetite for risk? Please check any that apply, or if you don't know, then we can move on and discuss how we would determine what our risk appetite is. Oh, looks like most people believe that their risk appetite is low to high. We have about 48% of you think that you have a medium appetite for risk. So what does that really mean, right? We can go through our webinar here and find out exactly how your risk appetite plays into how you're going to plan for your business continuity. So after you've determined your risk appetite, you have to determine what the end game is. What do you want your final goal to be? Is your goal just to protect the employees or just to protect the physical assets? Or is your final goal to maintain a 98% on-time shipment? You have to understand how your goals play into your risks, how your goals play into every area of the operation, and how each one of those areas of the operation interact with each other. To do that, again, we'll look at the requirements that you have to observe or analyze within this process. So risk analysis. Risk analysis is a really big component of determining your business continuity plans. With risk analysis, it helps you understand exactly where your risk is coming from. The risk analysis can be anything. You need to look outside of all your four walls. You need to look at your dependencies. You need to look at what's going on when. So risks could happen from anywhere. Right now we have COVID-19. That's a huge risk. That's changed tremendously what most organizations are having to deal with. You're having to restrict your workforce. You're having to have 6-foot spacing between operations. You're having to provide additional protective gear. You've had a lot of stores that have closed, a lot of businesses that have spent a good time in a closed scenario, and then you have to restart that business. And even that restarting of that business is actually a risk that if you do not identify, then you won't be able to plan for that risk going forward. You can have mechanical failure, just not on a full-scale basis, but what happens if part of your distribution center goes down for 2 days because of mechanical failure? How do you address that? Where do you send the orders to? How do you make sure that the customers, which are your stores or the end users in an e-com situation, are actually taken care of? What happens as with COVID, a lot of things that happened affected the supply chain. How do you address that? Do you have the right components in the building? How do you look at a supply chain and identify those potential threats? So risk analysis within the business continuity plan helps you understand that, and helps you understand that there are more risks out there that are just within your four walls. And what the risks that you have to understand and then consider, there are many things that play into that. So in a distribution facility, it could be critical equipment. You need to identify all the critical equipment in your building that you really couldn't live without. Is it one subsystem? Is it a main trunk line? Is it scanners? What is it that within your facility that you really could not live without, or that would have a defined period of downtime that was allowable? You need to consider resources. And resources aren't just, you're going to have a maintenance team there. You're going to have the whole operations team there. What happens if you lose an essential skill set? What skill sets do you have that you can't afford to lose? Do you have one PLC guy that can handle any downtime in the building? Do you have a very small IT staff? So is IT and PLC your essential skill sets? Or is it the merge operator? Or is it the HR manager? So you need to identify what skill sets you would find detrimental if you lost that within a time frame of disruption. And then going past that point, you need to look into your facility and your operation and identify what will and won't get completed if you have a complete smaller staff. What happened with COVID? Absenteeism is a huge issue. So what happens if you only have half the people show up to work today? If it's a natural disaster, you have a tornado, you have a hurricane, again, part of your resources are going to be at home dealing with what they have to deal with. What are you going to be able to do if they're not there? And what are you going to need to help mitigate those circumstances? You also need to look at budgets. I mean, resources is financial as well. So if you need to hire more people, have temporary contracts, getting cranes because you were in a natural disaster and you need to, prop up building walls, etc. You need to identify what those budget needs are in those particular instances. We mentioned supply chain earlier. Who are your critical vendors? Identify who those are and what would happen if you didn't get what they sent you on a weekly basis. Operations, identify those essential functions. And we'll talk a little bit more about that as we go along, because essential functions are very codependent in a lot of times. And what happens if part of those essential functions are disrupted, or part of the non-essential functions are disrupted, but they have a greater impact on the essential functions of that building? Subcontractors, a lot of people these days use those subcontractors, but understand that they are your subcontractors. And if there is a natural disaster or a viral outbreak like COVID, then those subcontractors are dealing with the same risks that you're dealing with. So you really hope that they have a business continuity plan because you rely on them for a lot of things. So maybe you need to look at secondary contractors. If you look at secondary contractors, again, that follows back over to resources. You know, how are you going to pay for them? Do you have them under contract? Is there a service level agreement that you have that upon notification they do something? So you need to identify what risk your subcontractors have, what secondary contractors are there, and then if there's any value add contractors out there that could actually take on more work. And then one of the biggest thing that plays into everybody's goals of taking care of their people is to evaluate any changes that have to be made to operate during the disruption and even potentially after the disruption. So perfect example is COVID. So what has to happen in your building to continue to operate? Do you have to, stay 6 feet apart? Can you actually do that in some of your operations? Or what do you have to move around to be able to do that? Do you have to move packing stations? Do you have to have temperature readings taken at the door? Things like that. So what is that has to happen? And then how do we do that is how it is further on down the road. But identifying that risk and what you have to have will help you make it through just some of these basic considerations. A primary way to see that graphically is, another polling question. So what do you feel is your organization's largest area of risk? Just by these, and I know that the ones that we went over are very limited, but if you had to choose one of these, what would you say would be your organization's largest area of risk? Some of them are not things that you normally think of, depending on your organization and what you do. Subcontractors got 0. That's kind of interesting. But supply chain, 40%. So 40% of you think your supply chain's at the largest risk. And I think we've all seen that throughout this COVID crisis, that there was a run at the grocery store, toilet paper of all things. So the supply chain can very definitely be at risk. But you have to understand that is supplying both ways. It's not only it's going out of your building, but what comes into your building as well. So a graphical way to understand your risk is actually through a risk matrix. And I know that we've all used risk matrices many times to identify many different things. But the development of this actually helps you understand where your highest risk is. So understanding that if you look at a basic footprint that has your consequence up at the top and maybe your likelihood down to one side, and you're really using this risk matrix to identify the extremities of the likelihood versus the consequence of your risk. So if you have 90% of your personnel absent in a day, and is that a insignificant risk, and is that based on the risk, is that rare or almost certain to happen? So if you had a tornado, it would almost be certain that you would have a high amount of absenteeism after a tornado. So that would probably fall in a major or critical category, which would make human resources themselves a very high and extreme potential for risk. In order to get through a risk matrix and get through this part of your continuity plan, as far as identifying and analyzing all your risks, you really have to collaborate closely with all the other functions in your building, whether it's HR or finance, your DC manager, your DC manager's boss's boss, and determine what the total focus is, and then how your part of the pie fits into that. So, risk mitigation. We've identified what our risks are. and we are looking at our risks to understand how critical or non-critical they are. So there's really a couple of phases in risk mitigation, and that's to analyze your risk, to reduce your risk, and to assure against it or avoid it. Most people would like to avoid the risk, but that takes on many different shapes and functions. So to analyze your risk, that's used in assessing different areas of your operation, whether it's equipment assessments, whether it's operational assessments. A SWOT analysis is very healthy and a very good tool for you to use to understand what your strengths and weaknesses are, which really helps you understand that risk. And then it gives you, as one of your preventive strategies, it allows you to go in and say, hey, I need to take a look at my network and assess whether or not I have a network that has enough backup and enough bandwidth and everything else to handle if we would go down. What would be the time frame that I could get that back up? Or, we've been running 24/7 for 10 days or for 10 months even, or a year, been hard to get in there to do that preventive maintenance. So you may need to have an equipment assessment to go in there and analyze what particular pieces of equipment in your building would create a large risk for you if a disruption in your organization happened. Then you could look at the reduction strategies. So reducing your risk could be everything from, extended technical training for your technicians, to parts, to service contracts, to operational training for your team on the floor. So if you lost, some supervisors or some lead personnel in different operational areas, how are you going to cross-train those functions and make sure that you can reduce any risk from absenteeism or for losing a specific skill set? And then there's the assurance against risk, or total risk avoidance. And while we would love to totally avoid risk, I don't necessarily think that is an option. But sharing or transferring that risk, or at least a portion of that risk, is something that you can look at. And you can look at that from a resident services scenario where you outsource a lot of the operations in your building. You may outsource forklift operations, you may outsource maintenance operations, you may outsource IT operations to a certain extent, HVAC, anything like that. Obsolescence management, the last thing you want to do is get into a disruption scenario where your supply chain's affected and you have the last piece of computer equipment that you would have to go on eBay and find parts for. So really understanding the obsolescence in your building and having an obsolescence management plan, either provided by internally or provided by one of your value-added vendors, is a great way to try to ensure against or to avoid some risks that could happen during these uncertain times. And as you go through this, you can identify which areas of risk that you can mitigate. There are some that you may never have an answer for, but at least you've identified those and you can move on from that point as a risk that could be a very high potential. So after we've gone through the risk analysis, we've understood how to look at it graphically, so you can just pull up that risk matrix and understand what the big thing is that you have to address the red first, then go for the yellow, then address the green. We have to look at how really that impacts our business. So the goal here is a business continuity plan. So we've identified your risks. We have performed an analysis. We've tried to figure out mitigation ways to mitigate that risk, either the 10% of it or 100% of it. But now we really need to look at what that risk does to our business. So a business impact analysis would be the next component of your business continuity plan. And a business impact analysis really provides you a clear picture of your business operations based on the processes and the functions within those operations. It helps you identify dependencies, and it helps you identify what are the critical areas that you have to maintain the livelihood of your facility or your company, and then helps you address some additional strategies so that you can respond to the crisis and have a recovery plan. The risks and identifying the risk where you may have the risk of a wall falling down in a tornado is very scenario specific. A business impact analysis is not scenario specific. It doesn't matter if the threat is a virus or a tornado. The point is to identify the most critical processes and prepare to continue to operate regardless of what happens. So identifying and prioritizing those functions really is the goal of a business impact analysis. And that goes to, what does the financial and operational impact mean? What are critical functions? How to support those in different levels of severity? How do you estimate your recovery time? And then identifying what critical resources you have to have, and you have to have a secondary plan for. So what we consider in business impact analysis has a lot to do and really correlates a lot with our risk analysis. You need to look at financial impacts. So if you miss shipment today, what does that look like in lost sales or lost income to your distribution center, to your company? Is it delayed sales? But also on the other side, is it increased expenses? So if you have to call in emergency service for forklifts or emergency cranes or anything else, emergency labor, what do those increased expenses look like? But all of that is something to consider on your business impact. Resource impacts. So what's the what's the cost of absenteeism? What happens if you lose the one person in the building that can do X? What does it cost in overtime if you lose 25% of your staff, so you have to work longer shifts? All of that goes into your business impact analysis. Market analysis, that's something that's very intangible from a lot of levels of the organization. But if you are a company that can't make deliveries during a crisis, and what part of that market share goes somewhere else? We see a lot of that in e-commerce. If you cannot make that delivery to the end user, then they're going to go somewhere else to find that. And we've seen a lot of that happen, especially during COVID. So that customer defection, that dissatisfaction is intangible at the lowest level of the organization, but it's very real in how the organization recovers and their resiliency moving forward. Supply chain. Supply chain is not just conveyor parts or HVAC parts. What happens if you can't, if you can't get trucks out of your building to a brick and mortar store, or your brick and mortar store is closed or hit by a tornado? So what happens if you have to change your model to an e-commerce type model? How are you going to do that? How are you going to satisfy that customer needs, and what is that going to cost you? What impact is that going to cost you on your overall business? Operations. Operations is a lot, it has to do with everything. So are you changing your business model now because of requirements and demands? Are you having large swings in volume, either high or low? How do you address that? Depending on the type of threat that happened. Would you add people, reduce people? Would you change from a full case operation to a piece picking operation? So really, how does, what does it cost to do that in people and in money and other things? So all of that's something to consider in your business impact analysis. And then of course, subcontractors. If you need people from part-time agencies, if you need people from very technical locations, does your value add vendors need to provide you additional skill sets? They have to face, in large risk threats, they have to face the same thing that you do. So what happens to you if they have reduced capacity to help you. But at the same point in time, it's, you know, as part of that subcontractor, even UPS getting product to your customer or product to your store. So there's a lot of things that you really need to look at and understand how they affect your business overall. As with the risk matrix, you can look at this graphically, and it really has a lot of the same things. So first of all, to look at it graphically, you see a lot, especially in the center of the sample here, you see a lot that looks a lot like your risk matrix. You know, you have high impact on it as red, extreme impact is red or critical, high impact maybe orange, medium impact maybe yellow, to perfectly low impact. But this is something that graphically you would define your business function, define its total dependencies. So if I'm looking at a critical path operation in a DC, my dependencies might be IT, they might be my parts supplier, they might be my maintenance team, they might be orders. I mean, you're not, if you don't have boxes to ship, then you're not gonna, you know, that is a dependency. So what happens if a threat takes out your ability to get store orders or internet orders? So all of those things are dependencies that have a function with your business. So then you look at your customer impact. You know, what happens if you're down? Is it, if your critical path is down and you can't supply your stores, is that a critical impact or is that a low impact? Are you more brick and mortar or are you more e-commerce? So going through each one of these examples allows you the opportunity to really focus on what are your what are your critical business functions and what has the highest impact. You know, sometimes if you're a pharmaceutical company, maybe if your facility goes down, you have a huge legal impact because the FDA is not going to be happy or anything like that. So this really helps you look at your impact categories and determine whether those impact categories are, you know, if your business functions impact that to the high end or to the low end. And based on that impact, you can really decide what your recovery time objective is. So if your function is the critical path, what happens if you're down for 6 hours? You know, you may think that with your risk appetite that you can be down maybe 30 minutes and that large upswing in volume, that, you know, 30 minutes is all you can handle. You might be able to push it out to 1 or 2 hours, but that would be it because you would lose so much throughput in that facility that the cost of adding the extra labor, adding the extra shifts, adding the extra functions would be too high in that example. So you have to find some risk mitigation opportunities there to lower that, you know, that potential downtime. So after you look at this, it's kind of like the risk matrix. You can then define your overall priority. What functions are the most critical? Does that drive your allowable downtime up or down? Does that drive your recovery time up or down? And then it tells you just by visually what to focus on first and where to take your business at that point. So we've looked at, you know, we've defined our product. We have looked at our risks. We've identified options to mitigate our risk. We've determined what impact that risk would have on our business. You prioritized all your functions and all your dependencies. You know what processes that you need to run all the time, which ones you can supplement, which ones have to be changed. So what do you do now? So now you have to determine and develop what your response and recovery plan is. Your response plan is really that. It's a short-term plan. What do you have to happen right now? If there's a fire in the building, first thing you got to do is evacuate the people, call 911 and have the fire put out, right? So that's a very short-term plan. That's a response plan. But then what is your recovery plan under that same threat? So your recovery plan might be, okay, you determine what the total loss was. Was it water loss, or did part of the building burn? God forbid, was anybody hurt? So the recovery plan is really, what do you need to run that marathon? What do you need to go long term in order to get to make business operate again? It truly does really formulate and help you segregate what needs to happen now, who you need to call today, and what plans you need to put in place for later. So again, what do we consider? What do we consider in response and recovery plans? A lot of the same things, but there's same things coming out the other side of the risk. So you look at your resources, you look at your supply chain. Do you have alternative supplies of critical needs? Do you have emergency stock plans for stuff that's essential usable items in the building just to maintain the running of the building? But do you also have emergency stock plans for product that you're shipping out of the building, right? How are you going to get, how are you going to reroute that trailer load of toilet paper to make sure it gets to 17 different locations? Safety. All right, so you had a fire. First of all, you have to squeegee out the building or whatever, but what additional safety matters do you have to put in place? What a different training has to happen? Do you have to cordon off part of the building? Do you have to get your subcontractors or your vendors in to reroute some equipment to make sure that you can operate in the interim, much less long-term? And then of course, what that interim and long-term budget looks like to do that. So you need to just determine what's your first priority, both your first immediate priority, and then your first long-term priority in order to get your operation moving again. So the final phase in a business continuity plan is restoration. And restoration, you've planned, you've executed, you've analyzed, you've responded, you've recovered, but where do you go from here? So where does your operation go in the midst of COVID-19? A lot of the businesses have reopened, but they've reopened with different caveats that make normal operation not normal anymore. So what does that have to do with each process in your building? You've identified and done the legwork to understand what those processes are for the old model of operation, but you kind of have to do that again because your world may change. If you were a business that was brick and mortar, did your business swing to a large percentage of e-commerce business because a lot of the stores were closed? If you're in on the coast and a hurricane hits, where are you going to get that material in to sell to those customers and to provide for yourself? Are you going to ship them in from the closest DC, or what are you going to do from that? So as you hit the restoration phase and decide what your new normal really is, you kind of go through the same processes again. You define what that normal is. You assess your overall business at that point. Did the model change? Instead of 60% brick and mortar, direct to store replenishment, are you doing 70% e-commerce and 30% to the store now? Are you mixing that up based on store sales? Are you doing more e-commerce? Are you doing e-commerce in a different way? You're going to have to analyze that. Then you're going to have to analyze the different processes in your building again. Some of the processes that were the critical processes when you started are not the critical processes now. And then from there, again, you define your building blocks and you implement your plans. But through that, you identify your outcomes, you build the plan to get there, and you build the plan to continue your business in the critical processes as you move along. So being fully aware of your risk level, of your business impacts, not just your risk level, but your business impacts as well, and what needs to be done to keep your business operating. And it's a start. It's a start to understanding how you're going to be successful. But identifying and utilizing your networks and partners to mitigate your risks, to maintain your essential levels of service, that'll put you ahead of most of your competitors. So just making sure that you take everything into consideration will really help you get through that disruption or get through that threat, and then come out on the other side very successful. So I want to thank you for giving me the opportunity today to talk to you. And Tracy, I think we're ready.
Yes, absolutely. So thank you, Diane. That's really timely presentation. And as she mentioned, we are going to move on now to the Q&A portion of our event. And as a reminder, you can ask a question online at the bottom of your screen in the Q&A feature, and we will address that. But we do have quite a few questions that have come in. I did want to say, maybe just before we started on the questions, that apologies, we encountered a little bit of a technical glitch with that first poll question, but just so you're aware, 71% of those that responded, actually response was their number one choice, about 71%, and then recovery was after that at 65, and prevention at 58, with just about 6% had none of the above in place. So I thought you might be interested to know those results. But yeah, we will go ahead and move on to the Q&A here. And first question that has come in is, why wouldn't a business continuity plan be driven from the organization above the local level?
Well, that's a good question. But while somebody in another area of the country or senior level management, while they can give you the overall structure and the overall focus and expectations for your plan, the plan is very dependent upon each facility and each department and each facility. It helps you identify really what you have to do in order to meet that expectation. And it, even more importantly, it helps you identify what you can't do. Maybe it's an expectation that based on your current circumstance, you can't hit that level of continued operation. So what do you need to get there? It really takes you through the thought process and identifies what you can do, what you can't do, and helps you put some of those preventive measures in place.
Okay, let's see. Next question. Based on everything to consider and the effort this would require, what benefits does the facility or individual department see from a business continuity plan?
I think one of the biggest things is it really helps each individual department understand the business holistically. So while you may be a break pack manager, if you're working as part of this business continuity team, then it helps you understand the dependencies within your building, what you can't do until somebody does something else. And, it helps you understand your upstream and your downstream dependencies so that you can be more effective within operating your building in good times, much less in times of crisis. It also provides the opportunity for some cross-functional training. It assures that you'll have, assets available because you've identified those potential risks or areas where you need more funding in times of crisis. It provides, it helps you avoid liabilities, whether it's liability because of your employees or liability based on service level agreements or based on anything else within your organization.
Okay, let's see. When defining scope, how deep do you have to go in the organization?
You should at least look at your top 5 dependencies. So if my scope is to maintain shipping operations, right? That's my goal. So my scope may be maintain X% runtime on a conveyor system or whatever. If you identify the dependencies that help you maintain that, then those need to be in scope as well. So the conveyor can run all day, but if IT goes down, you're not going to sort to a door and you're not going to get an order in. So those are dependencies of that system running. So you at least need to take a look at least the top 5 dependencies that you have identified, because your scope is driven by your requirements, by the products and services, because your products and services give your customers value. That's the only reason that you have customers, is the value they see from what you're providing. And then also the risk appetite. So identifying at least 5 dependencies and putting them in scope will help you determine exactly what your risk is.
And this next question actually is good timing based on the one I just read. It's almost like a 2-part question, but what happens if you miss things in the scope?
You can always go back, right? If you get halfway down your risk analysis and you're like, oh my gosh, I can't address this because we missed something 3 steps up. So you can always go back. But if you just do a scope on a very high level, then what's going to end up happening is you won't have identified the risks and the dependencies, and you'll lose focus. So it really helps you to define the objectives. If you improperly scope, it limits your resources. So if I was looking at a situation and I didn't say that, in times of a tornado, we may need X, Y, and Z for building repair or for, just immediate response. But I didn't define that that was going to cost $300,000. That $300,000 is not something that comes by lightly. So you missed that, putting that need in your scope or that risk in your scope, and thus you don't have the funds to provide for it when it actually needs to happen.
Okay, what is an example of risk appetite?
Well, your risk appetite is what your organization's unwilling to accept. So an example is if you, and I think our polling question had 48% of you think that you have a medium risk appetite. So a medium risk appetite, if you're looking, is if you have 40% of your building not capable of running, would your organization be okay with that? Could you tolerate more than that? Or if you had something happened and you couldn't ship out of any door in the building or half the doors in the building, then your risk appetite, that would determine what your risk appetite is. So if your risk appetite is high, then you're willing to take on more risk and you're very confident that you can recover from basically anything. So if you're a skydiver, your risk appetite is high. If you won't cross the street, your risk appetite is very low. So that works the same way in business. If you think that you can recover from almost anything, a venture capitalist has a high risk appetite in a business type environment.
Okay, let's see here. Some more questions have come in. Why couldn't you expand your risk assessment and not have to complete the business impact analysis?
Well, the risk assessment focuses on what the threat is, what your potential threat is, and how severe you think those consequences are if it happens, right? Your business impact analysis is really taking it that step further and saying, okay, this is my risk. I understand that it may be, a critical risk if it happens to us, but then what are all the impacts that I have to look at? What are my financial impacts? What are my resource impacts? What are the impacts to my stores? Things like that. So the business impact analysis really just takes that risk a step further and gives you a good idea of what resources you need going forward, as well as how to truly build your response plans and your recovery plans based on how critical those impacts are to your business.
Okay, let's see here. What function in the impact analysis do the dependencies play?
And the dependencies add to many areas. The biggest thing is the hidden costs and the intangibles. There's a lot of hidden costs in every corner of every operation that you don't necessarily think about unless you value stream map that essential function, right? So you may end up with 50% absenteeism, but because you're getting in temp labor that's untrained, it may cost you 3 times as much to backfill your normal workforce. So that's something that a dependency would actually impact, because you don't necessarily understand the severity of the impact without looking down into those hidden corners.
Okay, I was just looking at the clock to see if we had time to answer one more question. But I think we are really out of time. We do have several more questions that have come in. So I'm sorry to be cutting that short, but thank you to everybody for your participation, and thanks to Diane for presenting and being able to answer all of those questions. If we were unable to answer your question during today's live event, we will send you a response via email. And as a reminder, within approximately 48 hours after this live event, you can access this presentation on demand at intelligrated.com/on-the-move. You will also receive an email in a couple of days with a link to the presentation, as well as to a white paper titled Make the Transition to Data-Driven Lifecycle Management. So on behalf of Honeywell Intelligrated, thank you for attending today's On the Move webinar. We hope you can join us for our last webinar next week in our June series, Adapting to Modern Omnichannel Retail Challenges. Registration information can be found on our website at intelligrated.com/on-the-move. So thank you and have a great day.